The door of Ellardine New Hall shut behind Tabitha Fenn at 4 o'clock on a wet afternoon in the last week of October, 1892, and it did not slam. That was the part she remembered afterward, lying awake in other people's cold rooms for the better part of a year. A slam would have been anger, and anger can be answered. This was a quiet, well-oiled, unhurried closing, the sound of a house that had decided something and did not intend to discuss it, and the small click of the latch was the politest noise that had ever ruined anybody. Her box stood on the gravel behind her in the rain. It was a corded deal box with her mother's initials burned into the lid, and it held everything she owned in the world. 2 dresses, a pair of boots being saved for winter, a hairbrush, a tin of buttons, a folded shawl, and a bundle of letters tied with a bootlace. It did not hold the garnet brooch. The brooch had been taken out of it that morning, in front of the cook and the 2 housemaids and the boot boy, and held up to the window light by a thin white hand, so that everybody in the servants' hall could see exactly what sort of a person had been let in among them. She had not stolen it. She said so once, in a level voice. Standing very straight in the middle of that hall with her hands at her sides, and then she did not say it again, because she saw within about 4 seconds that saying it a second time would sound like pleading, and pleading was the one thing she had promised her mother she would never do in that house. Mrs. Selina Rook, who was Gideon Halburn's sister and who ran the new hall the way a lock-keeper runs a gate, had said only, "You will be gone by 4. We shall not send for a constable because of what the district would make of it and because we are not unkind people." Then she had gone back upstairs, and the cook had looked at the floor, and the boot boy had gone out to fetch the box. So the door shut at 4, and Tabitha Fenn stood on the gravel of a house that had been built with money that was not honestly come by, though she did not know that yet, and counted what she had. $11 in a knotted handkerchief. No character, which in that county meant no place in any house within 40 miles, because Mrs. Rook wrote 3 letters a week and enjoyed writing them. A dead mother. A box. And rain coming on harder from the fells. She walked the 4 miles into Kirkby Ellers with the box roped on her back, and she did not look behind her at the lit windows, and that was the beginning of it. To understand why the door shut, you have to go back to a rented room over a chandler's shop in Lancaster 11 months earlier, where a woman named Charlotte Fenn was dying of the same weak chest that had kept her poor all her life. Charlotte was 54. She had spent 30 of those years taking in plain sewing, and the other 20 being a good deal too proud for her circumstances, and she had raised her daughter alone since Tabitha was 6. At the very end, when the talking was hard for her, Charlotte had said a thing she had never said in all those years. She said, "When I am gone, you are to go up into Westmoreland to the parish of Ellardine. You are not to ask them for money. You are to ask them for work, and you are to look at the place, and you are to remember that half of what you see there ought to have been mine." Tabitha had thought it was the fever talking. Old, poor women often carry a story about a great house they were cheated out of, and the stories are almost never true. But then Charlotte had made her fetch the bundle of letters from under the mattress, and had put into her hand a small garnet brooch, gold set, in the shape of a knot of leaves. Worn thin on the back where a thumb had rubbed it for years. "My mother's," Charlotte said. "She had 2. They took the other. Wear it where they can see it." And she said one more thing, which Tabitha wrote down that night, because she did not trust herself to keep it exactly. She said her name was Isabella. She was not mad, and she did not run away. She made things out of stone, and they shut the door on her, and then they shut the door on me, and I was 3 years old. Do not let them do it a third time. Then Charlotte Fenn died in November and was buried by the parish, and her daughter had a bundle of letters, a brooch, and a name. The letters were not proof of anything. Tabitha read them 100 times on the coach north. There were 4 short notes in a fine, slanted, confident hand, written from an address in Lancaster in the year 1842, addressed to a woman who had evidently been a servant, asking after the child, begging for word of her, promising to come as soon as she was strong enough. The last one was 3 lines long, and the hand had gone shaky. They were signed with an initial only. There was no surname anywhere in them, no address that still existed, and no lawyer in England would have looked at them twice. But there was a castle. That much anybody could see from the coach road. Ellardine Castle stood on a green shoulder above the beck with its back to the fell, a great grey rectangle of the 14th century with 2 round towers and a curtain wall and a gatehouse arch you could have driven a hay wagon through, and it had been standing empty since before the oldest man in the village was born. Its roofs had gone in places. Ivy had swallowed the north face entirely. Rooks lived in the west tower and had done for generations. Half a mile below it, in a park of planted beeches, stood Ellardine New Hall, which the Halburn family had built for themselves in 1846, with tall sash windows and a portico and a gravel sweep, and which was lit up every evening like a ship. Tabitha Fenn walked up to that portico in December in her one good dress and asked for work. She did not mention her mother. She did not mention Isabella. She gave her name as Fenn and said she could sew, read aloud, and keep accounts, and Mrs. Selina Rook, who was short of a still-room maid and liked the look of a girl who stood straight, took her on at a wage that would have insulted a scullery cat. For 3 months, it went well enough. She slept in an attic with a slanted ceiling. She rose at 5. She learned the house, and she watched. She watched the way the family talked about the castle above them, which was always in the same tone, the tone of a man discussing a rotten tooth he cannot afford to have out. She learned that Gideon Halburn was in debt to 2 banks and a wine merchant. That land had been going out of the estate in pieces for 11 years, and that the new hall was kept up on the appearance of money rather than on any of it. She learned the house the way a servant learns a house, which is to say completely and from underneath. She knew which boards spoke on the back stair, and which of the bedroom fires drew badly, and which of the good dinner plates had been sold and replaced with a cheaper pattern that only matched at a distance. She knew that the wine merchant's man came to the side door now and would not come to the front. She knew that Mrs. Rook did the accounts herself, at night with the door shut, and that on some of those nights she came out of that room with a face like a closed drawer, and in the long drawing room, on the west wall between the 2 windows, there was a rectangle. It was the sort of thing nobody notices in their own house because it has been there their whole life. The wallpaper of that room was a pale green stripe, faded everywhere by 30 years of afternoon light, except for one upright rectangle about 5 feet by 3, where the green was still green and the stripe was still crisp, with 4 small filled holes at the corners of it. Something had hung there for a long time and had come down and had never been replaced, and whatever went up in its place afterward had been smaller, because there was a second, fainter mark inside the first. Tabitha dusted that room twice a week for 3 months and looked at that rectangle every time and never once asked about it, and it was the thing she thought about lying awake in the attic. And she learned from the cook, who had been in the family service since she was a girl and who was fond of a hot gin, that there was one thing at the castle nobody was ever to go poking at. The garden, the cook said. The old mistress's garden, they call it. Walled all round, higher than this ceiling, and the arch bricked up solid. It has been bricked since before the new hall was ever built. Master Gideon's grandfather did it, and there is a saying in this house that whoever opens that arch opens the family with it, so nobody does. Tabitha asked, in the mildest voice she could manage, which mistress. The one that ran off, said the cook, the one they do not name. She was too careful for 4 days and not careful enough on the 5th. On a Sunday afternoon, with the family at church, she walked up the track to the castle and along the outside of the curtain wall until she came to the south side, and there it was, a stone gate arch with a carved lintel of leaves and a beast's head, set in a wall of dressed limestone 14 feet high and filled from threshold to keystone with brick. Neat brick. Somebody had cared about that work. The mortar had been struck and finished, the courses were true, and above it the wall itself had been raised by 4 extra courses of newer stone along its whole length, as though the height had not been thought enough. She put her hand flat on the brick. It was cold, and it did not move, and something behind it was growing, because a single gray sycamore branch had come up over the top of the wall in 50 years and was leaning out over the track. She was seen. A gardener saw her and said so at the house, and Mrs. Rook said nothing at all about it, which should have frightened her more than a scolding. 9 days later, the garnet brooch was found in the pocket of an apron in the still room, wrapped in a rag. And Mrs. Rook explained to the assembled servants that it was a halberd piece, that its fellow had been in the family's jewel case for 60 years, and that she had wondered from the beginning why a still-room maid should possess such a thing. Tabitha said it had been her mother's. Mrs. Rook said that was very likely what she had been told to say. And the door shut at 4 o'clock, quietly, and the latch clicked. The winter that followed was the sort that people do not describe afterward, because there is nothing in it to describe. She took a bed in a back room in Kirkby Ellers for a few coins a week, and she worked in Mrs. Dorcas Yeo's laundry, in steam, from 6 in the morning until 7 at night, with her hands in soda until the skin split at the knuckles and healed and split again. No house in the district would have her. 2 families as good as told her why. She wrote to Lancaster after a place and got no answer, and she did not write again, because the coach fare would have been a fortnight's food. There is a particular kind of poverty that goes with a bad name, and it is not the same as ordinary poverty. Ordinary poverty lets you be pitied. This one did not. She could not stand at a stall in the market without the woman behind it counting her change twice and slowly. She was not asked to the laundry women's Christmas supper, though nobody was unkind enough to tell her she was not asked. They simply talked about it in front of her for a fortnight and then talked about it afterward. When a shawl went missing off a line in February, it was found again on the Monday, but between the Friday and the Monday, nobody looked at her directly, and everybody knew where they had looked. Mrs. Dorcas Yeo, who owned the laundry and who had buried 2 husbands and taken no nonsense from either, said one thing about it once over the coppers. She said, "I do not care what they say up at the hall. I care whether the sheets come out white." And that was the whole of the kindness Tabitha Fenn had from anybody in that district for 11 months, and she remembered it for 50 years and put a window in the church for the woman when she died. What she did with the little that was left over was strange, and the laundry women teased her for it. She spent her half-days in the vestry of the parish church and in the reading room in Kendal when she could get the ride, going through anything with the name Ellardine on it, parish registers, the churchwarden's book, an old county history bound in green cloth, and the yellowed files of a newspaper that had died in the 60s. She found in the register a marriage in 1834 between Hector Halburn, gentleman, and Isabella Marchand, spinster, of the same parish. She found a baptism in 1838, Charlotte, daughter of the above. She found in the county history. One line that made her put the book down and go and stand outside in the cold for a while. The manor and castle of Ellardine came to the Halborn family by the marriage of 1834, the lands having been long in the possession of the Marchands. Long in the possession of the Marchands. So the place had not been his. It had been hers. And she found in the dead newspaper, in a column about the great memorial that had been put up in the cathedral at Carlisle in 1841, the name of the celebrated sculptor who had carved it, Aurelian Croy. The Ashendon Memorial, they called it, after the family who paid for it, a figure of a kneeling woman with her face uncovered, and behind her 3 standing figures, all cut from one bed of pale limestone, and the paper said it was the finest thing of its kind north of Lincoln, and that people came in carriages to look at it. The date stopped her. 1841. The garden had been bricked, said the cook, before the new hall was built. Isabella had gone in 1841 or thereabouts, and Charlotte, 3 years old, had been put out of that castle in the same year. It was not proof. She knew perfectly well it was not proof. But it was a shape, and once you have seen the shape of a thing, you cannot stop seeing it. In the last week of August, 1893, the estate of Ellardine came under the hammer. It had been coming for 2 years. Gideon Halburn owed more than the new hall was worth, and the mortgagees had lost patience, and the sale was advertised in 3 counties. The home farm, 4 cottages, 60 acres of grazing, the beach plantation, and at the very bottom of the bill, in the smallest type on the sheet, Lot 41. Lot 41 was the castle. It was described as the ancient ruin of Ellardine Castle, with the curtain wall, gatehouse, towers, and appurtenances, together with 3 acres more or less, and under the description was a paragraph in even smaller print explaining that the purchaser would take the lot subject to a standing obligation running with the land to maintain the south curtain wall in such condition as not to endanger the parish road beneath it. That paragraph was the whole reason nobody wanted it. The south wall was 160 feet of 14th century limestone leaning over a public highway, and whoever owned it owned the day it came down. 2 builders looked at it and went away. A gentleman from Manchester who wanted a ruin for the look of the thing read the covenant and stopped wanting one. The auctioneer, Mr. Nathaniel Quirk, had been trying for a month to get anybody to take it as a gift with the grazing attached, and had failed, and had privately told the solicitors that, in his opinion, Lot 41 was worthless and worse than worthless, being a liability with a view. The sale was held in the long room of the Ellardine Arms on a hot Thursday, with the windows open and the flies coming in. Tabitha Fenn walked the 4 miles in from Kirkby Ellers in her laundry dress and sat on the end of a bench at the back, and every person in that room who knew her face knew what she was supposed to have done in the new hall. And several of them made sure she saw them knowing it. She had, in a knotted handkerchief in her glove, everything she had saved in 11 months of standing over a copper. It came to a little under $9, and it was meant for the coach to Liverpool and a month's lodging while she looked for a place where nobody had heard of her. Lot after lot went. The home farm went to a grazier from Shap, the cottages went in a bundle, the beaches went to a timberman who was already looking at his watch. Gideon Halburn sat at the front in a pale summer coat with his sister beside him in black, watching the land go, and his face did not move at all, which some people admired and others did not. At 20 minutes to 5, Mr. Quirk came to the bottom of his sheet and said, in the voice of a man who wants his tea, Lot 41. The castle. Gentlemen, I am not going to pretend to you. You have all read the covenant. Will anybody start me at $50? Nobody started him at $50. 20, said Mr. Quirk. 10, come, somebody, $5 for a castle. It has stood 1,100 years, and it will very likely stand out the lot of us. Somebody at the back said, loudly, that it would stand until it fell on the road, and there was a laugh, and Mr. Quirk let the laugh run, because it was the liveliest thing that had happened all afternoon, and Tabitha Fenn stood up. She was not tall, and she was not loud, and there were 40 men between her and the rostrum, and what she said was, $3. The room did not laugh at once. There was a beat first, while everyone worked out that the still-room maid who had been turned out of the new hall for thieving was bidding on the Halburn family castle, and then it came, and it went on a good deal longer than it needed to. A man near the door was wiping his eyes. Somebody called out to ask whether she would be wanting a crown for the ceremony. Mrs. Rook turned round in her chair at the front and looked at her for a long moment with an expression of purest, quietest distaste, and turned back. Gideon Halborn laughed too. That was the detail the district repeated for years afterward, and it was true. He put his head back and laughed, and said to the man beside him, loud enough to carry, "Let her have it. $3 for 50 years of rubble and a wall that will bankrupt her before Christmas. Somebody knock it down to the girl." Mr. Quirk looked at the mortgagee's solicitor. The solicitor shrugged, because $3 is $3, and the alternative was carrying the lot away in his pocket. Mr. Quirk said, $3. Am I bid 4? No? For the third time then, and the hammer came down. She paid at the clerk's table with the room still emptying around her, 3 coins out of the handkerchief counted onto the green baize, and the clerk wrote out the memorandum, and she signed it, Tabitha Fenn, in a clear round hand, and a fortnight later at the office of Mr. Rufus Tunstall, solicitor, in Kendal. She took possession under a conveyance on 1 sheet of parchment with a wafer seal, and she owned a castle. Mr. Tunstall, who was a dry man of 60 with a way of looking at people over his spectacles as though they were a difficult claws, told her plainly that she had done a foolish thing. He explained the covenant to her twice. He told her that the parish surveyor would inspect the south wall every spring, and that if he served a notice on her, she could be sold up for the cost of the work. "I have nothing to be sold up for," said Tabitha. "You have a castle," said Mr. Tunstall. "Then I had better go and look at it," she said. She moved in on the 1st of September with a handcart borrowed from the laundry, and the whole village came out to watch her go up the track, and 1 or 2 of them cheered in a way that was not kind. What she had bought was this: a gatehouse arch with no gates, the hinges still in the stone, a courtyard of nettles and fallen slate the size of a market square, a great hall with no roof over its eastern half, its floor a green mat of grass and elder saplings, its fireplace big enough to stand up in, a west tower full of rooks and rook mess which she left to them, a north face so deep in ivy that the windows behind it were only guesses, and on the south side, running its whole length, a range of 2 stories that still had its roof on, a kitchen with a bread oven, a stone stair, and above it 4 rooms with dry floors and shutters that closed. She took the smallest of the 4 rooms because it was the easiest to warm. She swept it and washed it and put her deal box under the window and hung her 2 dresses on nails and lit a fire of dead elder in the little grate and sat on the floor with her back against the wall, 24 years old, alone inside 3 acres of England, and cried for about 10 minutes. And then stopped and made tea. The first night was the hardest night of her life, and she had had some competition. A castle is not quiet. It is full of water moving where you cannot see it, and slates lifting, and the rooks starting up all together at 2 a.m. for no reason a person can understand, and a great empty hall 2 walls away that gathers wind and lets it out again like breathing. 3 lads from the village came up in the dark and threw stones at her shutters and shouted that the Halburn ghosts would have her by morning. And she lay in the dark listening to the stones and did not get up, because getting up was what they had walked 4 miles for. In the morning, she went down and picked up the stones and put them on the wall by the gate in a neat row, where anybody coming up the track would see them. Nobody ever explained why that ended it, but it ended it. Two of those three lads worked for her within 4 years, and one of them carried her coffin. For the first month, she did nothing but the wall. She had promised herself that. Whatever else the place was, the covenant was real, and the covenant was the only thing that could take it away from her. So before she let herself go looking for anything, she went along the south curtain foot by foot with a barrow and a bucket, clearing the ivy roots and the fallen stuff, and she found, as she had half hoped, that the wall was not nearly as bad as its reputation. 2 sections had lost their capping and were shedding. The rest was sound to the depth of her arm. It was the wall work that brought Jonas Bly up the track. He came on a Tuesday, 68 years old, walking slowly with his cap in his hand, and stood in the gateway looking at what she had done to the fallen capping, and said, "You are stacking that wrong." He had been a mason all his life, and his father before him. He showed her how to sort the stone into faces and hearting, and how to know a through stone by the way it rang, and he came back on the Thursday, and after that most days, and would not take a coin because, he said, he was 70 in 2 years and there was nothing else he wanted to be doing. They worked along the south wall together into October, and the parish surveyor came in the spring following and wrote in his book that the wall at Ellardine was in better order than it had been in living memory, which was the first official sentence ever written in favor of Tabitha Fenn. But long before that, in the 3rd week of September, she went up onto the wall walk. The stair to it was in the east tower, and it was half choked with jackdaw sticks, and she went up it with a lantern in the late afternoon and came out on top of the curtain wall in a wind that pushed her sideways. From up there she could see the whole shape of the place at once, the courtyard, the ruined hall, the roofs of the south range, the track going down to the village, the new hall and its beaches with its windows catching the last of the light. And on the south side, tucked into the angle between the curtain wall and the great hall, held in by its own high wall of dressed limestone, there was a green rectangle about half an acre in size that was nothing but treetops. She stood there a long time looking down into it. It was a wood. 52 years of sycamore and ash had come up out of it and closed over the top, and bramble had climbed the inside of the walls and hung back down in ropes, and from up there she could see one straight pale line running through the green from end to end, which she understood after a while was a path, a broad flagged path, still holding its line under all that growth like a bone under skin. Gardens do not grow paths by themselves. Somebody had laid that. She went round to the arch that night with the lantern. She had not been near it since the Sunday that ruined her. It was exactly as she remembered, the carved lintel of leaves with the worn beast's head at the center, the 14 feet of dressed wall, and the brick filling the arch solid from the threshold stone to the keystone. Struck and finished and true. She stood there with the lantern up and read the wall the way Jonas Bly had taught her to read walls, and she saw something she had not seen in March, because in March she had not known how to look. The brick was not a shutting up. A shutting up is done quickly and roughly by men who want their supper. This was skilled work, and it was thick. She could see, at the edge where the brick met the stone jamb, that it was not one skin of brick, but two, with the courses bonded through, and mortar squeezed out and struck off clean on a face that nobody was ever meant to admire. Somebody had paid good money and taken good time to make sure that arch never opened again. The next morning she asked Jonas Bly about it, and he stopped stacking stone and stood up straight for the first time since she had known him. "I wondered when you would," he said. Then he sat down on the barrow and told her the only story he had, and he told it badly because he had never told it before. His father, Thomas Bly, had been a mason in Ellardine village. In the spring of 1841, Thomas Bly and 2 other men were engaged by Hector Halburn to fill the garden arch at the castle. They were paid 4 times the rate. They were told to work on the 2 days when the family was away, to take their meals up there, and to speak of it to nobody, and they were told when they asked what was to be done with the things inside, that nothing was to be done with the things inside, that they were not to go in at all, that they were to build from the outside, and that if any man set foot through that arch, he would be paid. Off on the spot, he built it double, said Jonas Bly. He put a header course every fourth, and he bedded it into the jam. My father was a proud workman, and he would not build a thing badly even to hide it. And he came home the second night, and my mother said he sat in that chair and did not eat. And after a while he said, I have done a wicked thing today for money, and I do not know what it was. He never said what he saw. He never went in. That was the whole of it, do you see? He was never let in. He said there was a smell of green coming over the top of that wall like a hayfield, and he said one of the other men climbed on the barrow to look and got such a mouthful of language from Mr. Halburn that he came down white, and after that nobody looked. The old man turned his cap over in his hands. He would not have the castle spoken of in the house. He died in 62. It is the only job of his I have never gone to look at. Tabitha said, I am going to open it. Jonas Bly was quiet for a while. Then he said, Aye. Well, then it had better be opened properly and not knocked about, because whatever is on the other side has had 52 years of nobody, and it will not want a sledge through it. They began on the 9th of October, and it took them 11 days. He would not let her rush. He set a line and took the brick down course by course from the top, the two of them on a scaffold of the castle's own fallen timber, dropping each brick into a basket and lowering the basket on a rope, because, he said, his father had laid them, and he was not going to have them lying about in bits. The mortar was the good hard lime of the old sort, and the dust of it got into everything, and by the fourth day Tabitha's hands were worse than the laundry had ever made them. On the sixth day they broke through. It was Jonas who did it, 3 courses down from the keystone, and the chisel went in and did not stop, and a thin black gap opened about the width of a hand, and out of it came a breath of air. Neither of them said anything for a moment. The air was cold, and it was full of green, leaf mold, wet stone, moss, and under it something sharper and sweeter that Tabitha could not name for a week, and then woke up one night knowing. It was box. There had been a box hedge in there once, and after 52 years the ghost of it was still in the air. She put her eye to the gap and saw nothing at all but leaves. They worked another 5 days, taking it down to shoulder height and then to the threshold, and on the 20th of October, at about 11 in the morning, under a low pewter sky, Tabitha Fenn stepped over the sill of the arch into a garden that had not been entered since the year her mother was 3 years old. Her first thought was that it was simply a wood, and she had been a fool. The sycamores were 40 feet high, and their trunks were as thick as her waist, and the light came down through them green and moving. Bramble was over everything in ropes and mounds, shoulder high in places, and there was elder and nettle and a wild rose gone up into the branches, and the wall on every side held it all in like water in a tank. She could not see 6 feet, but under her boots there was flagstone. She followed it. That was all she did for the first hour. She got down and followed the flags on her hands and knees under the bramble, pulling with a billhook, working along that pale bone of a path she had seen from the wall walk, and after about 30 feet the path widened into a circle. And in the middle of the circle there was a green mound the height of a man. She thought it was a stump. She put her hand into the ivy on the side of it to find out, and her fingers went in past the leaves and found, instead of bark, a surface that was cold and smooth and curved and worked. She pulled the ivy away in fistfuls. It came off in mats, 52 years of it, and it took her the best part of an hour, and both her hands were bleeding by the end of it, and what came out from under it was a woman. Limestone, pale as bread, a little over life size. A woman kneeling with her hands loose in her lap and her head turned up and to the side as if somebody had just come into the room behind her. Ivy roots had left a fine tracery on her cheek. There was moss in the folds of her sleeve. The face was not idealized and it was not pretty. It was somebody, a particular somebody, with a heavy jaw and wide-set eyes and a small crease between the brows, and the stone had been cut so finely that Tabitha could see the seam of the sleeve and the wear at the elbow. Tabitha Fenn sat down on the flagstones in front of it and did not move for a long time. Then she got up and went on and found the next one and the next. There were 31. It took her 11 days to find them all, and the greater part of 2 years to get them properly clear. They stood along the flagged path and in the cross paths on plinths of the same pale stone, and every one of them was a figure, and every one of them was finished. 2 women with a basket between them. An old man asleep, sitting up, his hands crossed on a stick. A young man laughing, caught with his head back. A woman shielding a candle with her hand, the fingers translucent thin where the stone had been cut down to catch the light. A washerwoman with her sleeves pushed above the elbow and her forearms swollen the way forearms actually swell, wringing a sheet, the twist of it going all the way up through her shoulders. A boy of 19 or 20 holding a hat and plainly wishing he were somewhere else. A woman standing quite straight with her hands at her sides and her chin up, wearing nothing grander than a working dress with a plain white collar, and Tabitha stood in front of that one for a long while before she understood why it made her uncomfortable. Which was that it was the posture she herself had taken in the servants' hall on the morning of the brooch, and that she had learned it from her mother, and that her mother had presumably learned it from somebody. None of them were gods or nymphs or allegories. There was not a laurel wreath in the whole half acre. They were all somebody, and most of them were somebody who worked. 4 standing figures in a row at the far end, taller than the rest, that Tabitha did not understand until much later. At the north end of the garden, backed against the wall of the great hall, there was a small stone building with a slate roof and a wide north window, about the size of a cottage kitchen. The door had swollen, and it took Jonas Bly and a crowbar an hour to open it. Inside it was dry. That was the miracle of the whole business, and it was not luck. The roof was good Westmoreland slate laid by somebody who knew. The wall behind it was the great hall's own 6 feet of masonry, and the north window had been shuttered, and the shutters had held. 52 years of Westmoreland weather had gone straight over the top of it. There was a long bench down the middle under a gray blanket of dust. On the bench, laid out in a row, were the tools, pitchers, points, claws, a dozen chisels graded by size, 2 wooden mallets worn to a bevel on one side, calipers, a rule, and a little brush. Somebody had cleaned them and laid them straight and left them. There was a modeling stand with a lump of clay on it, dried to a gray rock that had once been the beginning of a hand. There were 11 tall portfolio boxes stood on end along the wall like books on a shelf, each tied with a linen tape, and in them were the drawings. 340 of them by the count Tabitha made that winter, figure studies in red chalk, drapery studies. Sheets of hands, sheets of feet, and full-size cartoons in charcoal on joined paper, folded, each one docketed on the outside in a fine slanted, confident hand. And under the bench, pushed back against the wall, there was a chest. It was oak, banded with iron, about the size of a sheep, with 2 hasps and a small good lock of blackened steel, and it was not locked. The key was in it. Tabitha Fenn opened that chest at 4 o'clock in the afternoon on the last day of October, 1893, by the light of a lantern, exactly 1 year and 4 days after a door had been shut on her at the same hour, and this is what was in it. On the top, wrapped in oiled linen, a folded parchment of 4 skins, sewn with 3 seals hanging from it on parchment tags. It was the marriage settlement of 1834, made between the father of Isabella Marchand of the one part and Hector Halborn of the other. Tabitha could not read a quarter of it, but she could read enough, and Mr. Tunstall read her the rest a fortnight later in his office in Kendal, with his spectacles pushed up on his head, and what it said was this: that the castle, the park, the home farm and the lands of Ellardine were settled upon trustees to the use of Isabella Marchand for her life, and after her death to the use of the heirs of her body, and that the said Hector Halborn should have the use and enjoyment of the same during the marriage, and no estate or interest whatever beyond it. He had never owned an acre of it. He had married it, and he had used it, and the day she died it belonged to her child. Under the settlement there was a will, dated 1840, short, correct, witnessed by 2 names and drawn by a solicitor in Lancaster, leaving everything of which Isabella Halborn, formerly Marchand, was possessed to her daughter Charlotte absolutely. Under the will there was a bundle of letters tied with faded green tape, and these were the ones that emptied the room. They were from Aurelian Croy, and they ran from the autumn of 1838 to the summer of 1841, and they were in the celebrated sculptor's own hand, and there were 19 of them. The first ones were about work. Croy had been given the commission for the Ashendon Memorial, and Croy was in trouble with it, and Croy, it turned out, had known Isabella Marchand's work since she was a girl, and had seen the 4 standing figures she had cut at Ellardine for her own pleasure. He wrote asking her to carve the memorial and let it go out under his name. He put it very frankly. A woman could not take such a commission in that county in that year, and the family paying for it would not have it, and he would pay her the whole of the fee, less his expenses, and nobody need ever be the worse. The later ones were not about work. They were about her husband finding out. They were about money changing hands, and they were about Croy's growing fear, and the last of them, dated the 6th of June, 1841, was 4 lines long and said that he had done as Mr. Halborn required, that his name was on the stone and would remain there, and that he begged she would not write to him again as long as he lived. And at the bottom of the chest, in a small card box lined with wool, there was a garnet brooch, gold set, in the shape of a knot of leaves. The fellow of it was in Tabitha's dress pocket, where it had been since Mrs. Rook had put it back into her hand at the door with the words, "Take your evidence with you." Tabitha Fenn put the 2 of them side by side on the dusty bench in the lantern light and looked at them for a while, and then she sat down on the floor of a dead woman's workshop with her back against a chest full of the truth, and laughed until she had to stop and breathe. Then she took the lantern and went back out along the flagged path in the dark, all the way down to the far end of the garden, to the 4 standing figures that were taller than the rest, and that she had never understood. She had cleared them in the first fortnight, and had thought them the least interesting things in the place, because they were formal and still, and they did not have the ordinary human oddness of the others. 3 men and a woman, robed, standing shoulder to shoulder with their hands held in front of them, looking out over the box hedge at nothing in particular for 52 years. She had seen them before. She had seen them in a newspaper engraving in the reading room in Kendal, in a column about the finest thing of its kind north of Lincoln, standing in a row behind a kneeling woman with her face uncovered, in the cathedral at Carlisle under another person's name. They were the studies. They were the first cutting of the Ashendon 4, done here in this walled half-acre by a woman who was not allowed to sign anything, before the finished ones ever went south on a cart. And the kneeling woman in the middle of the garden with her head turned up, and to the side, the one Tabitha had pulled out of the ivy with her bare hands and sat down in front of and could not stop looking at, was the same figure that people came in carriages to see. She had been living for 6 weeks inside the rough draft of the most admired monument in the north of England. What happened after that took 2 years and 8 months, and it was not exciting, because the law is not exciting, but every step of it went one way. Mr. Rufus Tunstall, who had told her she was a fool to buy a castle, read the settlement twice and then stood up and shut his office door, which his clerk said afterward he had not seen him do in 19 years. He wrote to a firm in London. Counsel was instructed. The trustees of 1834 were long dead, but a settlement does not die with its trustees, and the deed was on parchment with its seals intact and had been sitting in a dry room for half a century, and the parish registers proved every link in the chain. Isabella to Charlotte, Charlotte to Tabitha, 3 names and 2 baptisms and a marriage. All of it written down in the same church that stood at the bottom of the hill. The Halburns fought it for 11 months, which was as long as their money lasted. Their case was that the deed was a forgery and that nobody could produce it because it had never existed, and that collapsed the moment the seals were examined. And after that, their case was that the family had held the land openly for 50 years and ought to keep it, and Mr. Tunstall's counsel observed to the court that a man cannot hold land openly against a deed he has hidden behind 2 skins of brick. There was one hard morning in the 2nd year when it was put to Tabitha in a courtroom in Carlisle that she was a person who had been turned out of a house for stealing a brooch, and she stood up and answered that yes, she had, and produced both brooches and the inventory of 1839 from the chest in which they were entered as a pair belonging to the mistress of Ellardine, and asked whether the court would like to know which of them the Halburn family had kept in its jewel case for 50 years. Nobody in that room ever forgot it. The reporter for the county paper wrote 3 columns, and the London papers took it up, and by the end of that week, the whole of England knew there was a laundry maid in Westmoreland who had bought a castle for $3 and found a garden in it. In the spring of 1896, the court gave judgment. The Ellardine settled lands were held to have passed on the death of Isabella Halborn to the heirs of her body, and Tabitha Fenn was declared entitled, and the estate was restored to her, the castle, which she already owned twice over, the park, the home farm, the beech plantation, and the ground on which Ellardine New Hall had been built with the money of the woman whose name that family would not say. The sales made out of the settled land over 11 years were unwound or compensated, and the accounting of that took another year and left her with less than the newspapers said, but it left her with enough. Gideon Halburn did not wait for the officers. He went abroad in the autumn and did not come back. Mrs. Selina Rook went to assist her in Harrogate. The new hall stood empty for a season, and Tabitha, who had thought about it for a long time and had been advised in both directions, did not pull it down and did not live in it. She let it to the county as a convalescent home for women out of the Manchester and Liverpool infirmaries at a rent of $1 a year, on condition the beech park was kept open to the parish. The rest of it belongs to Isabella. The drawings went to London. There were 340 of them, and they were docketed and dated in her own hand, and among them, folded in 4, was the full-size cartoon for the Ashendon Memorial, squared for transfer, with the 4 standing figures worked out in charcoal, and the kneeling woman's turned head drawn 11 times over on the same sheet until it came right. The dates on the cartoons ran a year and a half ahead of the dates on Croy's letters. 2 men came up from the Royal Academy and spent 4 days in the potting house, and one of them went down to Carlisle and stood in front of the memorial in the cathedral for a whole morning and came back and said, in front of Jonas Bligh, who told the story ever afterward, "It is the same hand." Anybody who has looked at stone for 20 years can see it is the same hand. We have all been standing in front of it saying his name. The chapter of the cathedral behaved better than anybody expected. They did not chisel Croy's name out because, they said, the lie was part of the history now, and cutting it away would be a second act of hiding. They put up a plate beside it instead, in plain lettering, which gives the name of the woman who carved the Ashendon Memorial, and the years of her life, and the fact that she was paid in silence. The 31 figures stayed where she left them. That was the one thing Tabitha would not be argued out of, and she was offered a great deal of money to be argued out of it. 6 of them went on loan for a year and came home. The rest stood in the garden where they had stood since 1841, and the sycamores came out, and the bramble came out, and Jonas Bly rebuilt the fallen bay of the north wall in his father's brick, because it seemed to him the right way to end the business, and the box hedge, which had never actually died, only gone leggy in the dark, was cut back hard and came again. There was one more thing out of the new hall, and it came up the track by itself in the second winter, carried under a shawl by the cook, who was 71 and had walked the whole way and would not sit down until she had got it off her. It was a portrait in a black frame, 5 feet by 3, of a dark-haired woman in a plain gray gown standing beside a table with a mallet on it. It had come off the drawing-room wall in 1841 and had gone into a box room over the stables, and the cook had known it was there since she was 14 and had kept quiet about it for 57 years for the perfectly good reason that people who did not keep quiet in that house did not stay in it. "I am past being turned off now," she said. "Where do you want her hung?" Tabitha hung her in the potting house, above the bench with the chisels laid in their row, facing the north window, and there she stayed. The face in the portrait had a heavy jaw and wide-set eyes and a small crease between the brows, and anybody who walked out afterward along the flag path to the circle where the kneeling woman is could see for themselves who had been the model for the finest thing of its kind north of Lincoln. The garden opened to the public on one day a week from the spring of 1897, at no charge through the arch that Thomas Bly had bricked up and his son had taken down. People came in carriages, as they had once come to the cathedral. The parish came free and often, including a good many people who had laughed in the long room of the Ellardine Arms and now brought their relations up the track and told them they had been there on the day. Tabitha Fenn lived in the south range of the castle for the rest of her life and got the roof back on the Great Hall in 1904 and never married, and was for 30 years the most obstinate correspondent the county surveyor ever had to deal with on the subject of that south wall, which never fell on the road and is standing yet. She kept both brooches in a card box on the mantelpiece and wore one on Sundays. She was asked once by a young woman from a magazine who had come up to write about the garden whether she had bought the castle because she had guessed what was inside it. "No," said Tabitha. "I bought it because it was $3 and nobody else would have it, and because they all laughed." And I had been laughed at that year until I did not much care any more what it cost me to stop. I did not know about the garden. I knew there was a wall with something behind it, and I knew a woman had been shut out of her own house and called mad for it, and that is not knowing. That is only refusing to agree. She thought about it, and then she said the other thing, which is the part that got printed. They shut that arch to keep a secret, but a thing that is sealed is a thing that is kept. Everything they were afraid of was in there, safe and dry and waiting for 52 years, because they were too frightened to burn it and too proud to look at it. They did not bury her, they preserved her. And then they sold me the key for $3 and laughed while they did it. The lintel over the arch still has its carved leaves and its worn beast's head, and the flag path still runs from it to the circle where the kneeling woman is. And on a wet afternoon in October, when the light comes down green and moving and the wall holds the wind off, you can hear the rooks in the west tower and nothing else at all.